Kicking off at number 5, Zoth-ommog, an entity that really lives up to its namesake of being weird, amorphous and full of tentacles. Zoth-ommog, also known as the Dweller in the Depths, is a great old one whose first appearance was in 1975's Out of the Ages by Lynn Carter, who then later emerged in Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series. Zoth-ommog is described as being distortedly cone-shaped and having 4 sucker-lined arms similar to that of a starfish, apexed with a tooth-filled maw and a great mane of tentacles. Zoth-ommog was spawned as the 3rd son of Cthulhu and Idya, untold eons ago in the binary star system of Zoth. His brood brothers and sisters are Ithaqua, Ithaqua and Cthulhu, and along with their father Cthulhu, they all shipped off to Earth. Eventually, Zoth-ommog was defeated in the long war with the Elder Gods, and he was imprisoned deep beneath the seabed near his father's tomb in the dead city of R'lyeh. He waits there for eternity, whispering into the darkness, waiting to cast his will into the dreams of mankind. Much like his dad. Coming in at number 4, Ihort. First appearing in the 1980 Ramsey Campbell novel Before the Storm, although appearing in reference notes since the late 60s, Ihort is quite the mysterious great old one. And that's saying something because, as you know, these guys are pretty elusive. Here's something to sum this guy up. His name is derived from the German word Ei, meaning egg, and Horten, which means horde. Yeah, he's a walking, clicking sack of great old one babies. Gross. Ihort, also known as the god of the labyrinth, lives in an endless network of caverns and tunnels situated beneath the Severn Valley in England, which is near where I grew up. No thank you. Ihort appears as an enormous gelatinous blob supported on hundreds of tiny bone-like legs. Its whole body is covered in a shifting, writhing mass of eyes which constantly disperse and reform at random. The real kicker though is the reason for Ihort's existence. It lives for the sole purpose of capturing humans who stray into its realm. Once it captures a poor, hopeless, unfortunate victim, it offers them a bargain. Either they allow Ihort to implant its young into their still living body and eventually after incubation burst into a disgusting brood of its vile babies, or be immediately and violently, gruesomely consumed. Yeah, I think I'll take the latter. Next up at number 3, Ithaqua. Otherwise known as the Windwalker or the god of the cold white silence, Ithaqua is the Lovecraftian equivalent of both the Wendigo and the Yeti, yet like with many of these terrifying great old ones, he's 1,000 feet tall and inspires horror on a cosmic scale. Ithaqua is an enormous humanoid with webbed feet and glowing red eyes who frequently stalks the Arctic wilderness, preying on the unwary and the unfortunate. Many of those who live in Ithaqua's hunting grounds leave sacrifices in a stark effort to appease the beast, but as you can guess, it's never very successful. Anyone who is unfortunate enough to be caught by Ithaqua are dragged off to his true home, the ice-ridden planet of Borea, where he aims to swell his growing band of worshippers. It gets weirder though because Ithaqua will then attempt to mate with any females by inserting a psychic seed into their womb, inevitably developing into a great old one offspring. He aims that one day one of these terrifying children will help in destroying their true enemy, the Elder Gods, though historically this hasn't gone too well and Ithaqua still waits for his true terrifying heir. Well, we said it before, but the great old ones are some pushy parents. Swinging in at number 2, Yig. And if you've got a fear of snakes, you may want to look away for this one. Yig, also known as the father of serpents, or even more conveniently, the snake god, has a pretty straightforward role in the pantheon of the great old ones, although it's in his method where the real fear lies. Yig manifests as a gigantic snake with the arms of a man, although he sometimes appears as a bizarre reptilian humanoid. Lizard people. Am I right? Yig is considered to be the god of snakes and serpents everywhere, and his fierce devotion to his children is the source of his wrath. When he emerges from his sleep, his sole purpose is to punish those who have harmed his serpentine brood. In The Curse of Yig, written in 1929 by Zelia Bishop and edited by H.P. Lovecraft himself, a couple from Arkansas moved to Oklahoma in search of a better life in the late 1800s. Unfortunately for them though, the husband has a fear of snakes and his wife deliberately destroys a nest of newborn rattlesnakes to ease his phobia. Well, yeah. Bad news, and Yig sends swarms of his children to attack the couple, killing their dog in the process. In the end, to ultimately take his vengeance, Yig forces the woman to kill her own husband with an axe before transforming her into a part human, part reptile monstrosity, cursing her to wriggle on her belly like a snake for all eternity. Yikes. And finally, at our number 1 spot, Azathoth. The big guy himself, and the fact that it's taken us 3 videos to finally reach this guy is saying something. Now, you see, it's difficult because Azathoth isn't a Great Old One or Elder God. He's an outer god, and that means that he doesn't concern himself with the likes of Cthulhu and his brood. He's an intangible horror, an entity that lurks in the darkest depths of space, writhing in an eternity of cosmic torment. Also known as the nuclear chaos, the demon sultan, and the blind idiot god. Azathoth's first appearance was in an unfinished 500-word short story written by Lovecraft in 1922, which would later be transformed into the dream quest of unknown Kadath. Azathoth exists outside reality, and there can be no definite description, as everyone envisions his ever-changing visage differently. He gave birth to the darkness, the nameless mist Nyarlathotep, and spat forth Yog-Sothoth. In The Insects from Shagai by Ramsey Campbell, his worshippers are many, and in a forest temple in the Goatswood, his cultists worship an idol carved in his image, a horrible, bestial, mouthless face with deep-sunk eyes and covered in glistening black hair. As far as Lovecraftian entities are concerned, they don't get much more cosmically terrifying than Azathoth, a creature so vile that even uttering his name can drive people to madness. I guess I best shut up then. Kicking off at number 5, Rhan Tegoth. And it's in the form and implication of this particular Great Old One where the Lovecraftian terror truly lies, because as will be the case with many entries on this list, many of the shambling horrors that lurk within the deep have a particularly apocalyptic purpose, and Rhan Tegoth's cosmic significance pretty much spells the end of civilization as we know it. Well, that's if it wakes up anyway, so let's tread carefully. Created by Hazel Held with an accredited co-creation from Lovecraft himself, Rhan Tegoth's first appearance came in the astounding short story The Horror in the Museum, which is exactly as it sounds, and yes, a Lovecraftian protagonist was stupid enough to find a Great Old One and stick it in a museum. And as we all know, that's terrible for business. Also known as the Terror of the Hominids, yes, as in us, and he of the Ivory Throne, Rhan Tegoth is described as a 15-foot Medusa-esque insectoid amphibious god that is particularly acclimatized in the deep dark ocean. For millennia it lived in the vaporous boiling seas of Yuggoth before its machinations were devised, and it was hurtled toward Earth roughly 3 million years ago during the Pliocene epoch, where it landed in a remote part of Alaska and commenced its slumber. As The Horror in the Museum describes, it was discovered by a George Rogers in 1926, where it was briefly contained in London before being lost to a shadowy cult, briefly appearing again in the 1980s and the 1990s. The thing is with Rhan Tegoth, although of little power compared to the rest of its brood, this guy spells the return of the Old Ones. When it crashed into Earth, it was the last of the cosmic horrors to fall asleep, and the High Priest himself intended Rhan Tegoth to be the first one to awake, to herald the return of the Great Old Ones. Coming in next at number 4, the Shoggoths. Because although we've covered Great Old Ones, outer gods and shambling horrors alike, I feel that we're yet to fully take a look at some of the more monstrous races that inhabit the Cthulhu mythos, and perhaps the most vile and interesting of those creations are the Shoggoths, one of Lovecraft's most curious and divisive devices, who have played an incredibly interesting yet equally horrifying role in the mythos. The Shoggoths are a race of amorphous, shape-shifting beings originally created by the Elder Things through highly advanced genetic engineering to serve them for eternity as formless tools that would do their bidding. The Shoggoths are blobs of self-shaping gelatinous flesh, almost like an amoeba, and are capable of shaping themselves into whatever organ or shape they find needful. The Elder Things abused them for eons, creating their vast underwater cities and ancient kingdoms deep in the bowels of planet Earth. The thing is though, despite being thoughtless writhing masses of tentacles and maws, eventually after millennia they mutated and developed sentience, where they rebelled against their masters and consumed them, and from there they created their own giant cities, which is where we first got a taste of the horrifying Shoggoths in Lovecraftian fiction in 1931's At the Mountains of Madness, where the last remnants of this vile race of fleshy beings were found buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice by the one and only William Dyer. And as it turns out, the last Shoggoth had sustained itself by feasting on penguins, which makes it that much more evil. Next up at number 3, Tsathoggua. And this guy comes from a long line of Great Old Ones that are incredibly difficult to pronounce, which even for Lovecraftian fiction is probably on the more master tier side of deciphering the eldritch tongue, but whatever. I'll give it a go. Tsathoggua, whose grandfather is Xashkluth, whose father is Gisguth, whose mother is Jesus Christ, what is that? whose mother is Stilzemgi and whose child is known as Vilpoggua. Okay, nailed it. Maybe, I think so. But anyway, the point is this particular Great Old One was created by Clark Ashton Smith, one of Lovecraft's contemporaries, who, whilst having a penchant for language, also had a desire to create some of the vilest, weirdest cosmic horrors in the genre. Tsathoggua, also known as the Sleeper of Nakai, is a Great Old One, often appearing in the form of a monstrous, vile, toad-like creature who is often found asleep in the deep bowels of his kingdom, waiting for eternity for sacrificial offerings. He's definitely the couch dweller of the brood, but the slothfulness of Tsathoggua is exactly what makes him so horrifying. Deep beneath the earth, Tsathoggua waits within his black temple, where his will is carried out by a writhing, formless spawn of polymorphic entities made of black goo that sit inside his throne in basins carved from ancient stone. Although the Great Old One himself rarely moves, the formless spawn are alive and writhing within his kingdom, ready to consume any curious adventurer or lost soul that stumbles upon him, where they'll attach themselves with their undulating appendages, rip their flesh to shreds and feed it to their master bit by bit. Perhaps more than any other Great Old One in the mythos, Tsathoggua isn't willing to lift a finger to bring about an apocalyptic cosmic horror. He'd just rather get fat and sit on his obsidian throne and wait for it to come to him. Lazy. Swinging in at number 2, Byatis, and I absolutely adore the lore behind this particular deity, simply for the fact that it approaches human history in an incredibly interesting and equally terrifying way. When you think of Lovecraftian fiction, you don't exactly think of the Roman Empire, do you? Well, let me introduce you to the serpent-bearded Byatis, the Berkeley toad, a writhing, multicoloured entity with a single eye, the claws of a crab, and an endless beard of tentacles. His appearance is caught somewhere between a spider, somewhere between a crab, and somewhere between the horror that lies at the end of all dreams. Created by Robert Bloch, Byatis first appeared in the September 1935 issue of Weird Tales, but would later go on to play an integral role in Ramsey Campbell's 1964 short story, The Room in the Castle. Although not exactly on the most powerful scale compared to the rest of the Great Old Ones, in ancient times Byatis was summoned to Earth by the Deep Ones to join the rest of his brood, but yet during some unknown event Byatis was cut off from the rest of his ilk by the warring elder gods and sealed behind a stone door in what would later become the Severn Valley. Eons later, when the Romans conquered Britain, a small band of soldiers heard the whisperings of the Great Old One and became corrupted by his will. Driven mad with cosmic torment, the Roman soldiers formed a cult around the god, which were eventually consumed by his eldritch will in a failed attempt to escape the stone seal. Centuries later, a Norman castle was built over the site that contained Byatis' prison, and it wasn't until the 18th century when Byatis was discovered by a warlock named Sir Gilbert Morley and eventually used as a puppet for his dark arts. For hundreds of years, Byatis would feast upon the townsfolk offered to him by Morley to keep his primal needs satiated, but eventually Byatis became so large that he trapped himself within his cavernous prison for eternity. Well, until he sheds a few pounds at least, and then I'm guessing he'll be really mad. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Ubbo Sathla. And our final spot is reserved for an incredibly interesting and different kind of Lovecraftian concept, because although this specific anomalous entity is very much an outer god of the Cthulhu mythos, one of the most powerful ancient beings in existence, it's also a creation that is far removed from anything else. Let me introduce you to Ubbo Sathla, which is perhaps the eldritch progenitor of all life as we know it. Yeah, get ready for an existential kind of crisis. Ubbo Sathla, also known as the unbegotten source or the demiurge, is a huge protoplasmic mass resting within a forgotten grotto deep beneath the frozen earth. The being itself is a life form like few others within the mythos and is comprised of a mass of writhing substances spontaneously generating primordial single-celled organisms that pour unceasingly from its shapeless form. It is thought that Ubbo Sathla was the original spawn of all forms of life on Earth, spitting forth prototype after prototype before it reached its cosmic epoch, and just as the giver of life, it can also just as easily take it away, as whatever its endless mass of pseudopods touch becomes forever devoid of life. Created by Clark Ashton Smith again and first appearing in its short story of the same name, the ultimate purpose of Ubbo Sathla is relatively unclear, yet deep within its ancient hive it is said to guard a set of stone tablets believed to contain a hidden knowledge of the elder gods. However, some cultists also profess that Ubbo Sathla's destiny is to someday reabsorb all living things on Earth back from whence whence they came, consuming it back into its endless, formless shape of Ubbo Sathla. It is also said that in ancient times the demiurge split off a portion of itself and became the vile protean mass known as Uphoth, the source of uncleanliness that now resides deep beneath the horrifying landscape of Mount Vormithadreth, spitting forth endless horrors of miscreation and abomination. Yeah, if you can't tell, Ubbo Sathla is pretty damn terrifying, and this eldritch horror has its fingers in many pies. I mean, if it had fingers. Kicking off at number 5, Shaurash-ho. And whilst we've previously plunged into some of the more horrifying monstrous races in Lovecraftian fiction, we have to also give note to the terrifying ghouls, and their even more ravenous and grotesque progenitor, Shaurash-ho, the father of all ghouls, also known as the prowler amongst the tombs. In the expanded universe of the Cthulhu mythos, little is described about the nature of the elder gods, who are thought to have served as the deities of many earthly religions, but are in fact eldritch abominations themselves. Now, there's a lot of incestuous crossover when it comes to the lineage of cosmic horrors, but it is thought that Shaurash-ho is a direct descendant of Cthulhu himself, who then went on to mate with another descendant of Cthulhu, the elder god Bast, in order to create the cultish race of ghouls who now lurk in the shadows of Earth and the tumultuous dreamlands, worshipping whichever cosmic horror that they can get their hands on. Yeah. It's pretty messed up. Although his appearance has never been outwardly described, Lovecraft himself penned mention of Shaurash-ho in many of his correspondences and tied the relentless progenitor to many other vile creations of the mythos, such as Kabar the serpent and Gnoth the burrower, who was alluded to have been created after Shaurash-ho seduced and mated with a Roman noblewoman, Vibernia, an actual historical figure who just so happened to be the legendary ancestor of Lovecraft himself. Again, yeah, it's pretty damn messed up. I mean, I'm not entirely sure whether I want to know more about Shaurash-ho or whether I'm thankful that he never made it out of the confines of Lovecraft's letters. Either way, Shaurash-ho, in fictional terms or otherwise, just so happens to be the actual distant ancestor of Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Yeah. Coming in at number 4, the Flying Polyps, which is a fun phrase to say, isn't it? And no, these guys aren't a miraculous group of trapeze artists and tightrope walkers travelling the world in a pop-up circus, but instead one of the most inherently vile races of aliens in the wider Lovecraftian universe. As described in The Shadow Out of Time in their first and only appearance, they were a horrible elder race of half-polypus, utterly alien entities which had come through space from immeasurably distant universes to dominate Earth alongside 3 other solar planets about 600 million years ago. They first colonized Earth before the arrival of the great race of Yith, the only cosmic entities to keep record of the terrifying alien mysteries, who were notably evasive on describing them, making fearful references but shying away from any actual description. We know that they are capable of flight despite having no wings or appendages to do so, and seem to demonstrate an innate propensity to control air currents for offensive manipulation purposes. Although airborne, they also seem to leave behind a strange 5-toed radial footprint wherever they went, a disturbing footnote that features in The Shadow Out of Time. The Flying Polyps first built immense and vast cities out of basalt in their new territory of Earth, where they dominated the planet as an aggressive and predatory species before coming into contact with the technologically superior Yithians millions of years later. After a bloody and violent war, the great race of Yith prevailed, although they only managed to force the polyps back to their subterranean catacombs that lay deep beneath their basalt cities, sealing off the tunnels in an eternal tomb, where they now presumably wait to be released. Yeah, that's often the case with Lovecraftian fiction, isn't it? Don't look down. Next up at number 3, Kalut. And if you have a particular fear for giant earwigs and centipedes, then you're probably going to want to look away for this fleshy Lovecraftian entity. Also known as the Ravenous One, Kalut is a gigantic insectoid larva-like horror that dwells deep within the nebulous realm of Kgilmnon, a galaxy of pure cosmic nightmare that was first introduced in the 1998 publication His Hour Upon the Stage by J.B. Lee. Although written outside the timeline of most of the Lovecraftian expanded universe, Kalut seems to exist in stark opposition to the outer gods of Azathoth and his brood, and also seems to suggest that the life forms progenited by the nuclear chaos weren't the only creations in the infinite mystery of the universe, which is a terrifying notion in itself, isn't it? After all, if Kalut wasn't created by Azathoth, the origin of all cosmic horror, Where did it come from? Daoloth is an alien entity of unimaginable power, with its most prominent abilities being mind manipulation, telepathy, omniscience, immortality, and perhaps even the potency to warp reality itself. In the pantheon of the Yog-Sothoth, it is suggested that Daoloth may even rival Nyarlathotep in power, and it is thought that the Ravenous One is as old as reality itself, giving light to the fact that Daoloth may be a Lovecraftian entity like no other, opening up the pathway to an infinite realm of terrifying possibilities. In his Nightmare Galaxy, Daoloth is worshipped by an insectoid race known as the Gowroids, alien parasites that seem to possess a diminished supernatural portion of their god's power. It is thought that Daoloth created the insectoid servant race from his own flesh purely to serve him, as the Gowroids are one of the only cultist races in the Cthulhu mythos that thrive alongside the god that they worship. Swinging in at number 2, Daoloth. And this one is a pretty difficult horror concept to accurately portray, and like many of these Lovecraftian entities, as well as the wider anomalies of the Cthulhu mythos that have expanded upon them, the true fear of Daoloth lies in the implication of its design. Also known as the Render of Veils or the Parter of Veils, Daoloth is a member of the Outer Gods, a collection of perhaps the most powerful cosmic horrors in the universe, brothers and sisters of the all-knowing and all-slumbering Azathoth, the blind idiot god. And much like Azathoth, as well as the nameless mist, Daoloth dwells within a dimension beyond that of our comprehension. Daoloth's worship is incredibly rare on Earth, as even the most fanatical of cultists have never even heard whispers of his name, but instead the Outer God is worshipped by a small sect of astrologer priests in the forgotten corners of the cosmos, and their zealotry and devotion to him reward an unimaginable power. Those that successfully worship Daoloth are said to be able to see the past, the future, and even the minute gateways where objects extend and travel between different dimensions. Where that power comes from is anyone's guess entirely, because the actual eldritch function of Daoloth is of immeasurable complexity. Daoloth can only be summoned in pitch black darkness by his cultists, as his vast and indescribable shape causes even the most devout worshippers to go mad at the sight of him. If that's not existentially terrifying enough, if he's not held within the confines of some kind of magical containment, the Render of Veils will continue to expand, perhaps even at an infinite rate, and those enveloped by the god are transported to a bizarre remote world of impossible design where they quickly die a horrible death. Created by Ramsey Campbell and appearing in his short story The Render of Veils, Daoloth is perhaps one of the most mysterious entities in Lovecraftian fiction, and that's saying something. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the High Priest Not to Be Described, which, although it sounds like a pretty unnecessary title, perhaps may be one of the most mysterious creatures in Lovecraftian fiction. And I know that I've said that quite a bit throughout this mystery-inducing video, but you'll soon find out just exactly why. In Lovecraft's 1926 novella The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter finds himself thrust into the chaotic and horrifying world of the Dreamlands as he flicks between eldritch realities, stumbling upon a whole host of horrifying and bizarre creation. At one point, Carter is captured and taken to the Plateau of Leng, where he is taken down through a labyrinth of tunnels deep beneath the bowels of the Dreamlands and is forced into an audience with a creature known only as the High Priest Not to Be Described. Although in direct disregard for its title, the creature is described by Lovecraft as a lumpish figure robed in yellow silk, wearing a similar silken mask that communicates only through a bizarre and unsettling ivory flute. Instantly, Randolph Carter knows that the creature he is staring at is a horror of unimaginable power, and quickly loses his mind after fleeing and throwing one of the High Priest's servants down an impossibly deep pit. Although only brief in appearance, many have speculated as to the true origin of this High Priest, with the majority suggesting that Hastur, the King in Yellow, is the prime suspect. However, that doesn't explain the fact that this story was written before August Derleth made the connection between Hastur and the Yellow King, and the High Priest's yellow silken robes are thought to be merely a coincidence. Others have claimed that the most likely suspect is the crawling horror himself, Nyarlathotep, although to counter that, it's important to note that Nyarlathotep appears elsewhere in this novella, directly described in his pharaoh form, leaving us to scratch our heads as to who the hell this horrifying High Priest actually is, and what Randolph Carter saw to inspire such unfathomable fear. It seems that in the Dreamlands there may be entities that are more unimaginable and terrifying than even the Outer Gods themselves.